Al, I want to speak with you about the legacy of Christopher Columbus and especially the social dimensions. We can look at this question from many angles. We can talk about the religious side of it. Here we had this collision between two very different religious outlooks of Catholic Spain and the Indian religion, so centered on the master spirit, the earth spirit, and so on. And we could look at it from an economic kind of viewpoint, where we see that Europe needed to find new trading partners and so on. There's the whole political side of it, that the Indian tribes were so decentralized that they couldn't defend themselves. But I want to turn to the social dimension of the legacy of Columbus. And as I begin to think about that, one of the questions that comes to my mind is the role of diseases that occurred. As we know, the Indian population was probably just decimated through this encounter with the Europeans, through smallpox and so on. It's often said that they were enslaved and treated badly, and that this was certainly true, but the thing that really wiped out the Indians in this country were the diseases brought by the Europeans, and they simply had no immunity to them. Of course, it went the other way, too, especially with syphilis that the Europeans got from the Indians and then took back to the old world. So maybe we could explore that side of it for a minute, as we talk about this social dimension, the role of diseases, illnesses, and so on.
Well, it's now fairly well established that the indigenous peoples of the Americas migrated from what is now Siberia, Mongolia, Asia, across the Bering Straits at a time when they were not underwater, migrated into the New World anywhere from 50,000 to probably about 20,000 years ago, probably the more recent date. At the time of the migration,
gradually spread
southward all the way down to Patagonia. Mm-hmm. Now, at the time of those migrations, the disease strains that were later to decimate Europe and Asia simply did not exist. They therefore had no natural immunity to things like bubonic plague, smallpox, diphtheria, the common cold. Once they came into contact with those disease strains, they simply had no natural means of resistance. So consequently, the contact experience often led to massive deaths. We have one of the early episodes of this is reported by the first English to explore the Carolinas, the Roanoke venture, which was sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh. It was noted that shortly after contact with the English, the Indians started dying in droves. The English assumed that God was punishing the Indians for some kind of witchcraft that they were practicing against the English, took it as a sort of sign of God's favor on their venture. The Indians were demoralized, terrified by it, and what have you. But the early account indicates that that could occur very, very rapidly and with very disastrous results.
And if we think there were 100 million Indians in both North and South America altogether, if you accept that figure, and you would think that maybe 90% of those Indians got wiped out through this contact with Europeans.
The depopulation in the Americas, within a century after the establishment of the first European colonies, is in the range of around 90%. I don't think anyone can say precisely how much of that is due to disease, how much of it is due to warfare or exploitation or other factors. But the overwhelming, preponderant cause of death was epidemic disease.
This had a role to play also, I think, in the conversion process, at least in South America. Part of my sense of this is that when the Indians saw what was happening, they also made the same assumption that the Europeans did. That is, that somehow God was involved in this, and that God must have been on the side of these Europeans, and that maybe this religion of the Europeans, this Christianity, was a superior religion. And I think that it played a major role in the conversion process, and I think one could understand that among people given over to many magical practices and so on, and sensing the power of the Spirit at work in the world and in the earth and so on, in the natural world, that somehow this other God was more powerful, and that maybe they should join up. I think thus one of the explanations, at least, for the tremendous conversion rate that occurred in the areas that the Spanish dealt with.
I think that's true of the Spanish colonies, and in the Spanish colonies there was also the advantage that once conversion occurred, there was a place in colonial society for the Indian, which wasn't necessarily true in some of the other colonies. More of that later on. But actually it cut both ways. In many cases the Indians were impressed by the fact that Europeans seemed to be relatively immune to disease. I believe they did enjoy the favor of the Great Spirit. By the very same token, their own shamans, their own medicine men, their own healers couldn't heal these diseases and died of them themselves. That led to a tremendous demoralization. Indian societies, being highly decentralized, also relied very much on kinship relationships, and generational gaps started appearing as a result of the diseases. On the other hand, you also have some cases in which Christian missionaries are blamed for the disease. And among some of the Indian groups in Canada, for example, there are cases of priests suffering martyrdom because the Indians assumed that they were somehow evil shamans, evil medicine men who'd brought death.
Was that one of the reasons for the martyrdom of many of the missionaries in the north?
In several cases, yes.
They were seen as the evil medicine men.
Yeah.
Well, I think it turned it around. Did not Europeans often see the medicine men in the Indian cultures as somehow depraved people or in a league with the devil, and therefore it created just a desire to either wipe out these Indians or to get them away from that devil worship. So I think they saw the shamans within the Indian culture as somehow in league with the devil.
Oh, absolutely. They were persuaded, and this is almost universal, that not only Indian religion but all of Indian culture was diabolical in nature. There was a very prevalent theory to the effect that the devil really ruled in the New World, and that various manifestations of Indian culture, such as the practice of human sacrifice or cannibalism, or for that matter, very innocent shamanic magical rites, were essentially forms of devil worship. It had two effects. You don't have to try to understand those people. If you can simply label their culture as diabolical, it simply needs to be extirpated culturally. And it also led to the assumption that the only hope for the Indian was essentially to convert to Christianity, and that in order to convert to Christianity, the Indian culture had to be set aside completely. The only place I know of where there was a systematic effort to maintain intact Indian culture was among the Jesuits in New France, and that in large measure was for strategic reasons. The Jesuits in New France relied upon the Indians essentially as trading partners and military allies. There weren't that many French people there. It was necessary essentially to make some pragmatic accommodations to maintain the integrity of the Indian groups. They couldn't all be placed in missions or subordinated because French population was very sparse. Now, out of that led to a much more perceptive understanding of Indian culture. The greatest source we have in North America for understanding the Indians is the Jesuit relation, the reports of the French missionaries in Canada, who, working among the Indians as autonomous, independent tribes, allied to the French, came to gain some understandings that modified, in some respects, some of these stereotypes. But that's very exceptional.
Now, let me take you back to another figure, I think, who was very influential in Europe, and that is Vespucci. I think there's sort of two lines coming back out of the New World. Columbus and his reports to the king and queen about what he saw, which started out, it seems to me, very idyllic, and there were these wonderful sort of noble savages who would give us their gold if we asked them, would do anything that they wanted for us. And then we have this other kind of report, and maybe you could say a little bit about that, what we get from Vespucci and all this.
Well, Vespucci's reports of the peoples of the New World do a lot to establish a stereotype that haunts the European mind for centuries.
First of all, he was over here.
He claimed to be over here.
Oh, we're not sure of that. Huh?
Well, that's a somewhat complicated issue. He made probably 2 voyages. He claimed 4. I guess a basic key to understanding Amerigo Vespucci is to understand that he wasn't an honest man, that a great deal of what he said was made up. Now, there are some scholars who claim that he wasn't the one that did the forgeries and what have you, but in any case, his accounts are unreliable. Now, he made some claims about Indian culture that ran something like this. He claimed, for one thing, that the Indians lived in a total state of sexual anarchy, that they had nothing resembling marriage or morality, that any Indian would copulate with any other Indian, that an Indian male might have relations with any woman, including his wife or daughter. He made statements to the effect that there were Indian groups that relied entirely on human beings as their source of protein, that they were engaging in culinary cannibalism and what have you. He portrayed Indians essentially as a people who were almost subhuman. Now, his accounts are extremely inaccurate. They're fanciful, and yet they were accepted as authoritative, and they did a great deal essentially to set an image of the peoples of America as essentially subhuman and very depraved.
Let's just locate this historically. Columbus himself died in 1506,
right,
as I'm remembering it. Do we remember when Vespucci died here? I mean, he was still living after Columbus died.
Yes, he survived Columbus, and he was acquainted with Columbus. And
it was through his writings then that
he became involved in a couple of voyages to the New World. And wrote several letters purporting to describe what occurred during these 4 voyages. And these letters were much more popular than Columbus's.
Right, they got a bigger play, right, yeah.
They had an enormous influence.
And worked their way to England, as I recall, too, did they not?
Well, yes, the primary source for the image of very savage people in the New World that you find in Sir Thomas More's Utopia comes directly from Vespucci. As a matter of fact, it may be that Vespucci was More's only source. And More describes in Utopia essentially a colony established by people who were of Greek ancestry, who civilized savage peoples. Utopia is sometimes regarded as a sort of celebration of pristine American innocence. If you read the text carefully, that's not what it's saying. Mm-hmm. And the first book on the Indian, describing Indian culture, published in the English language, is based on Vespucci, and it gives this fantastic picture of a totally degraded, animalistic kind of people.
Also, he is important in terms of his first name, right?
Well, that's right. A German geographer by the name of Martin Wolsemüller, decided to name the New World America because he believed at the time that Amerigo Vespucci was the true discoverer of the South American continent, and the name stuck. Interestingly enough, Wolsemüller later changed his mind and removed America as the name of the continent in a later edition, but it nonetheless lingered. There's a great argument as to who was the first person to understand intellectually that this was not part of Asia, but was a separate continent. And Vespucci did have that understanding.
But so did Columbus. And I think that's often forgotten in all this, because Columbus himself, in his later writings, insisted that he did find a continent and tried to argue to that effect.
Well, he did and he didn't. Yes.
Explain that.
You can find in Columbus's early voyages, he's making quite an effort to insist dogmatically that he's really in Asia.
Right.
Later, when he discovers the mouth of the Orinoco River and some related mountains, he decides that he has discovered, of all things, the earthly paradise. And he decides that the earth is not actually a sphere, it is shaped rather like a pear, and he describes the earthly paradise as a nipple. And he knows that it isn't Asia. And so to that extent, he gets caught up in this mystical idea that he's discovered something very different. Later, he seems to revert to the notion that he somehow opened up a new route to Asia. A number of scholars can make a very good argument, however, that Columbus did have a pretty clear geographical understanding by, the end of his 4th voyage, and that the sense that he never really figured out that he wasn't in Asia is false.
So you get a dispute among historians along
you do.
This line, yes.
I guess that the dispute centers on the question as to whether Columbus was simply engaging in some mystical fantasies about the earthly paradise, or whether he really had a good, sound, practical understanding of what he discovered.
Of what he had discovered, yeah. Al, let's look at. We're trying to look at this socially and culturally and so on. Let's say a little bit about the European culture at that time. And one of the things we were mentioning before is this disease thing went both ways, and so the thing that came back to Europe was syphilis, and which they didn't understand, and was causing them all kind of problems there. But let's say a little bit more about the matrix there, the social fabric and the culture as we knew it in Catholic Spain at this time.
Well, Europe's undergoing a crisis at this time. First of all, Europe is not terribly prosperous. Plague and famine are still major problems. Europe is not wealthy. It has a very unfavorable balance of trade with the rest of the world and difficulty of establishing trade routes. The level of literacy is not all that high. And Europe is just undergoing a process of political consolidation. Intellectually, Europe is suspended somewhere between the medieval and the modern worldview, but probably in terms of thought patterns and attitudes, it's far more medieval than modern. But I guess one thing that we have to bear in mind about Europe, 2 points. First of all, religion is a very, very important factor.
Religion and culture are tightly wound together in this society.
Tied together. The kind of secularization that you find in some Renaissance thinkers is very, very atypical. And the second thing about religion is it's not the kind of humanistic Christianity that we have become accustomed to in later times. It is a crusading, intolerant, mystical, dogmatic kind of faith. And I think that's true whether you're talking about the Catholic or the later Protestant incarnations. And for Spain in particular, having just expelled the Moors and the Jews, Spanish Christianity is the Christianity of the sword.
And we have to bring in the Inquisition to this whole thing. It created difficulties for people in terms of being different religiously. People who had more mystical tendencies had to be careful or they might get in trouble with the Inquisition. I think that maybe there's interplay with Columbus and all that. He must have had that in mind at times and had to be careful of some of his own musings, I would think.
Columbus's religious ideas are quite fascinating. Basically, he had a strong sense of personal destiny and a strong sense of providential calling.
Yeah, God was calling him to do something.
His religion also, in some ways, was not merely mystical in the sense of seeking ineffable experiences. He would dabble in things like numerology and the symbolism of numbers or the meanings of obscure biblical texts. A key to understanding Columbus and his motivation is to understand that he is a part of a sort of crisis phase in Christian thought that looks to the last days. It's in some ways both pessimistic and aggressive. There's the sense that society is failing and the end of the world may be near and the barbarians are at the gate. But on the other hand, there's the sense that the church militant, particularly the Spanish monarchy, might turn the tables by a glorious crusade. All of that is part of Columbus'
I want to pick up on one element of that, and that is the attitude towards death. Of course, Europe was having all kind of problems due to the plagues and so on, but I think that in the Indian cultures we find a much greater acceptance of death as part of the whole process of life. Do you want to comment on that at all? Seems to me that maybe the Indians saw death as going to the Great Spirit. They had the sense of the importance of the ancestors, and the burial grounds were important. That became a great problem later on when they were uprooted from their place, the sacred places in which they lived. So it looks to me like we got a great cultural difference on this whole question of death at this time as these two cultures collide or interact.
One of the real perplexing problems to try to sort out is the sense of what the Indians understood in terms of life after death. If you read some Christian sources, and I'm thinking of Roger Williams, for example, they'll say that Indians believed in heaven and hell, and in the Last Judgment, and what have you. Other sources suggest that that's not the case at all. I have a rather strong feeling that Indians were less concerned with guilt, felt less alienated, perhaps, from the natural world and the Creator, which they saw in pantheistic terms as much the same. This may be a kind of romanticism, but while there are certainly elements of fear and anxiety in their lives and in their religiosity, I don't see them as obsessed with death and damnation and guilt and hellfire as Christians were. There is a morbidity in Christian culture in this period, which writers like, the popular writer Barbara Tuchman developed brilliantly, in the obsessions with the dance of death and what have you. Much of that is a result of the catastrophe of the plagues that gripped Europe. Much of it was also the result of a kind of religiosity which in many ways was dark and involuted.
Mm-hmm. More of a redemptive scent, guilt, redemption motif. And I think you'd find that also among the English Protestants who were colonizing the North America. It seems to me that among the Indian cultures, then death was seen much more as a part of life, as a natural process that you went through, thus not as great a fear of death. And maybe, how about burial practices or funeral practices? Do we know anything about that gives us a clue about how the Indians perceived death itself and what was happening to the person?
Well, I think they believed in personal immortality, and the reason I say that is if you take a look at Indian archaeological sites in Ohio or New England, the areas I know well, in many, though not all periods, they interred the dead with certain grave goods, which I think were probably clearly intended for life in the hereafter. So I think the Indians had a belief in an immortality.
So two things would have helped them, that kind of faith and also this sense of the natural process of life that they seem to be very involved in.
One thing that impresses me very much is the Indians of New England, which is the area I study, frequently and over many thousands of years covered the dead with red ochre. Now, no one knows exactly what that symbolized. I think it was a symbol of blood and rebirth, of a sort of supernatural placenta. A sense that there's a sort of return
there's other
to the
examples
womb.
in the Indian cultures of the importance of blood, of getting you in touch with the deity, and even whatever we know about human sacrifice among the Mesoamerican Indians seems to have that sense to it, that this was a way of renewing the earth or keeping the bonds alive, the dynamic with the deities and so on.
Well, one thing is clear. The description of Indian religion and of shamanic practice simply as a kind of evil devil worship is far, far from the mark. Indians may have had a different sense of good and evil than Christians had. In some ways, I don't think they drew those distinctions quite as sharply. I think they tended to regard the world and the spirits in rather different terms. I don't think personal evil meant as much to them. I think they were more concerned with taboos and harmony and manipulation of nature than they were with guilt and sin in the Christian sense.
Definite difference there. You're thinking about this clash of cultures that occurred starting in 1492 with Columbus and what it's done to both the European and the Indian cultures today. I know in reading some things by Native Americans, they're really saying that we should respond to this whole quincentennial celebration by learning from the Indian culture. One was saying it should make us more conscious of what we put into the earth and take away from it. It should cause us to love our children more and try to make them into world leaders, be conscious of noise and try to be more quiet. Walk, don't ride, hold old people in respect, love and respect animals. This is from an Indian source of saying how we should celebrate this quincentennial. I think the point, and Vine Deloria makes the same thing, that really there's only 500,000 of us Indians left in the United States territory, but that they have a superior way of life, and they could show the country how to act, as he said, humanly. And it would revise their institutions and so on. So and help us to see property in a different light. So when you start to look at it from the viewpoint of the Indians, it all looks very different. They're still sitting there saying, no, what we had, these traditions are precisely what you need today in the dominant developed Western world. More care for nature. This is going to help the ecology, etc. And you ought to look at us again. It's not just that you forgot to look at us there back in the 15th century, 16th century, but you're still continuing to make that mistake today, and you better come back and look more closely, because our culture and our religion have something to teach you. Now, that's a voice I think that it's interesting to hear at this quincentennial celebration.
Well, I think probably if we can gain any really useful insights from our examination of these things, that would be pretty close to it. These rituals of guilt and blame, I think, are not terribly useful. I don't always agree with Vine Deloria's Indian ethnocentrism. I don't really believe God is red. I don't think he's any particular color. But I do think that the Western European Anglo-American notion that the earth and its resources are just there to exploit, and that the best life is to get as much and to be as aggressive as possible, I think we're discovering its limits. And I think that there is a certain wisdom in the ability of tribal people to seek harmony and balance.
It's not necessary to idealize the Indian people to realize they did live in these lands for centuries without despoiling them, and keeping the land healthy and keeping the ecosystem in harmony and so on. They did learn how to do that, and much of their religious outlook moved them to do that. So you don't have to make them into, some idealized form of human being to realize they did pragmatically a good job along that line.
The separation that we all too often make between the secular and the spiritual didn't exist in Indian culture. In that sense, they saw the earth as essentially sacred.
Al, I want to thank you for sharing some of your insights into Indians. I recognize in what you have to say not just a vast scholarship, but also a genuine feel for these people and a feel for the culture. And it comes across, I think, to us as something, we could learn from them. There's valuable lessons to be learned. We could have a more fruitful encounter with this culture today than some of our ancestors were able to effect, including Christopher Columbus.